The disappearance and murder of Anne Paetz, Michigan's unsolved cold case. The ghost on the shoulder of I-75. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to American Gothic. Tonight, we're not just telling a story. We're standing on the haunted shoulder of a Michigan highway, staring into the abyss of a question that has tormented a family and baffled investigators for over 4 decades. The night of April 10, 1980, was cold for early spring in Michigan. A raw, damp wind swept across the flat farmlands, rattling the bare branches of trees that lined the interstate. It was a night for staying indoors. A night where the darkness outside the glow of your headlights felt absolute. Ancient, for the truckers and late-night travelers humming along Interstate 75. It was just another Thursday. But for one young woman, that darkness was about to swallow her whole. Her name was Anne Paetz, and on a desolate stretch of asphalt just north of the Clio exit, her life, a story filled with love, art, and promise, came to a sudden, violent, and terrifying stop. It begins, as so many of these stories do, not with a scream, but with a silence, an absence. A 1974 Ford Pinto, its metallic green paint dulled under the orange highway lamps, sat parked on the gravel shoulder. Its hazard lights were not flashing. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, a purse sat untouched on the passenger seat. A wallet with $24 still tucked within. The keys were in the ignition. Everything looked normal, except for the flat rear tire and the profound, chilling emptiness of the driver's seat. Anne Paetz was gone. She had vanished into the cold Michigan night, leaving behind a ghost car and a mystery that would curdle into one of the state's most enduring and heartbreaking cold cases. This is her story. Chapter 1. The Girl with the Paint-Stained Hands. To understand the void Anne Paetz left behind, you have to understand the vibrant life that filled it. At 23, Anne was a whirlwind of creative energy and quiet determination. She wasn't a headline waiting to happen. She was a daughter, a sister, a fiancée, an artist. She was the kind of person who noticed the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, the subtle shifts in color as dusk settled over a field. The world, to Anne, was a canvas. Born and raised in the close-knit community of Saginaw, Anne had that Midwestern warmth about her, a genuine smile that could disarm a stranger. But beneath that gentle exterior was a fierce passion for her art. Her small apartment near the University of Michigan, where she was finishing her degree, was a controlled chaos of easels, stretched canvases, and the sharp, pleasant smell of turpentine and oil paints. Her hands were perpetually stained with flecks of cerulean blue and burnt sienna, a testament to her dedication. Her professors saw a rare talent, a unique voice that was just beginning to emerge in her expressive, often melancholic, landscapes of the Michigan countryside she knew so well. Her family remembers her as the steady, thoughtful one. Her mother, Eleanor, would later tell detectives, her voice thick with a grief that would never fade. Anne wasn't reckless. She was the most sensible of my children. If you told her to be home by midnight, she'd be walking through the door at 11:59. She called when she said she would call. Always. This reliability was the bedrock of her life. It was what made her relationship with her fiancé, David Pohl, so strong. They had met at the university, two bright minds finding an easy comfort in each other's company. David was studying engineering, a world of precise angles and unyielding physics, which he found to be a perfect complement to Anne's world of abstract emotion and color. They were planning a wedding for the following year. They'd talk for hours about the future, a small house with a studio for her, a workshop for him, a dog, maybe a couple of kids. It was a simple, beautiful, and utterly achievable dream. Friends described Anne as loyal and kind, though she carried a quiet shyness. She wasn't one for loud parties, preferring a small circle of close friends, a bottle of wine, and deep conversation. She loved the music of Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, the poetry of Sylvia Plath. There was a depth to her, a well of introspection that made her art so compelling. She was on the cusp of everything. Her final exhibition of student work had been met with praise, and a small gallery in Ann Arbor had expressed interest in showing some of her pieces. Life was unfurling before her exactly as she had planned. It was this girl, the artist, the daughter, the fiancée, the dreamer, who got into her green Ford Pinto on the evening of April 10, 1980. She was in Ypsilanti, visiting David. They had spent the evening together, a perfectly ordinary evening filled with laughter and plans for the weekend. Around 9:30 p.m., she kissed him goodbye, promising to call him the second she got back to her parents' house in Saginaw. A drive that should have taken just over an hour. Drive safe, he'd told her, a casual, loving farewell that would later echo in his mind with the force of a gunshot. Always do, she'd replied with that easy smile of hers. She merged onto US 23 North, which would soon become I-75. A straight shot home. The road was familiar, a ribbon of concrete she had traveled dozens of times. She was surrounded by the familiar dark shapes of the Michigan landscape she so often painted. But on this night, the landscape was hiding a different kind of darkness. A darkness that was waiting for her. As she drove, the future she was building, the life she was living, the person she was, were all racing toward a single, random, and brutal point of annihilation on the side of a lonely highway. The world was about to lose its color. Chapter 2, The Timeline of a Disappearance. For detectives, the first 48 hours are everything. They call it the golden window, the period when trails are warmest, memories are sharpest, and the chances of finding a missing person alive are at their highest. But for Anne Paetz, that window slammed shut before anyone even knew she was gone. Her disappearance was a silent one, a slow dawning horror that began with a single, unanswered phone call. Thursday, April 10, 1980, 9:30 p.m., Anne Paetz leaves her fiancé David Pohl's apartment in Ypsilanti. She is driving her 1974 green Ford Pinto. She's heading north to her parents' home in Saginaw, an approximate 70-mile drive. Her estimated time of arrival is around 10:45 p.m. She promises David she will call him the moment she gets in. 10:45 p.m., in Saginaw. Eleanor and Joseph Paetz watch the clock tick past their daughter's expected arrival time. They aren't panicked yet. A little traffic, a stop for gas, there could be a dozen simple reasons for a slight delay. In Ypsilanti, David Pohl waits by his phone. 11 p.m., the phone at the Paetz residence remains silent. David's phone doesn't ring. A quiet seed of worry begins to sprout. This was unlike Anne. 11:15 p.m., approximate, a Michigan State Police trooper on routine patrol on northbound I-75 notices a Ford Pinto parked on the shoulder near the M57 Clio exit. In Vienna Township, the location is desolate, bordered by woods and farmland. He sees no one around the vehicle and assumes the driver has walked to the nearby exit for help or has been picked up by a friend. In 1980, it wasn't standard procedure to stop and investigate every abandoned vehicle immediately unless it posed a clear traffic hazard. He makes a note of it and continues his patrol. 11:30 p.m., worry turns to genuine fear. David calls the Paetz home. Has she arrived yet? He asks. His voice tight. The answer is no. They begin a frantic, helpless series of calls. To Anne's friends. To other family members. Every call ends with the same answer. No one has seen her. No one has heard from her. Friday, April 11th, 1980, 12:30 a.m., Joseph Paetz, unable to sit still any longer, gets in his car and begins driving the route Anne would have taken. His headlights cutting through the darkness, scanning the shoulders of I-75 for any sign of the green Pinto. He drives all the way to Flint and back, a father's desperate search yielding nothing but more anxiety. 2:30 a.m., the Paetz family officially reports their daughter missing to the Michigan State Police. Morning, the same trooper who saw the Pinto the night before is starting his day shift. He hears the bolo, be on the lookout, for Anne Paetz and her vehicle. The description clicks in his mind. He radios in, directing officers to the location he noted. 9 a.m., a Saginaw County Sheriff's deputy arrives at the scene. The green Pinto is still there, exactly as the trooper had seen it hours earlier. It's now officially a crime scene. The car sits about a quarter-mile south of the Clio exit ramp. The scene is processed with a grim sense of foreboding. The initial findings inside and around the car painted a deeply unsettling picture. The driver's side door was unlocked. The passenger door locked. Her purse was on the seat, containing her wallet, ID, and cash. This immediately ruled out a simple robbery. On the floor was a book and some of her art supplies. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the off position. The most critical clue was outside the car. The rear passenger side tire was flat. The jack was on the ground near the tire, but it hadn't been fully set up. 4 of the 5 lug nuts had been removed and were placed neatly on the hubcap, which sat on the gravel beside the wheel. The 5th lug nut was still on the wheel, but it had been loosened. Easy to turn by hand. The evidence screamed of a staged event. The lug nuts hadn't been cross-threaded or stripped, as might happen if an inexperienced person was struggling to change a tire. They were intentionally loosened. Someone had deliberately disabled Anne's car. Detective Frank Miller of the Saginaw County Sheriff's Department was one of the first investigators on the scene. He was a veteran cop in his late 40s, a man with a perpetually weary look in his eyes that came from years of staring into the worst parts of human nature. He stood by the Pinto, the spring wind whipping at his trench coat, and felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. "This isn't a breakdown," he said to his younger, more eager partner, Detective Dave Rossi. "This is a trap, a spider's web." Rossi nodded, jotting notes. "So the killer disables the car, waits for her to pull over, and then approaches. Or he pulls over with her," Miller corrected, his gaze sweeping the empty highway. "He plays the Good Samaritan. Looks like you've got some car trouble there. Mom, let me give you a hand." It's the perfect lure. She's a young woman, alone on a dark highway. She'd be scared. She'd be grateful for the help. The theory was chillingly plausible. The police began an immediate, widespread search. K-9 units were brought in, their barks echoing through the damp woods bordering the interstate. They followed a faint scent trail that led away from the car for about 50 yards before it vanished at the edge of the pavement, suggesting Anne had gotten into another vehicle. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the vast, empty fields and dense thickets of Genesee and Saginaw counties. News of the missing university student spread quickly. Her picture was on every local news channel, a smiling, bright-eyed young woman with soft brown hair. The photo, taken from a family gathering, radiated warmth and life, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile facts of her disappearance. The question hung heavy in the Michigan air: where was Anne Paetz? The golden window had closed, and with every passing hour, the hope of finding her alive was dimming, replaced by a growing, collective dread. The spider, it seemed, had already claimed its victim. Chapter 3: The Discovery in the Ditch. For 12 agonizing days, there was nothing. 12 days of frantic hope warring with crushing despair for the Paetz family. 12 days of investigators chasing dead-end leads, of search parties combing through miles of unforgiving terrain, and of a community holding its breath. The green Ford Pinto was towed to the police impound, a silent monument to the mystery. The news cycle began to move on, Anne's story slowly slipping from the front page. But for those who loved her, and for the detectives who refused to give up, the world had stopped turning on April 10th. The break in the case, when it finally came, was not the one anyone had been praying for. On the morning of Tuesday, April 22, 1980, a maintenance worker for the Saginaw County Drain Commission was performing a routine inspection of a drainage ditch along South Bayer Road in Tamath Township. It was a remote, rural area, a patchwork of farm fields and quiet country roads about 15 miles northeast of where Anne's car had been found. The air was cool, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was a beautiful spring day, full of the promise of life and renewal. As the worker walked the edge of the ditch, a flash of color in the murky water and tangled reeds caught his eye. It was out of place in the landscape of muted greens and browns. He moved closer, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The initial flicker of curiosity curdled into shock, then horror. He scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, and sprinted to his truck to radio for help. Detective Miller and Rossi arrived to a scene cordoned off with yellow tape. The stark color a violent slash against the tranquil landscape. The pastoral beauty of the morning was gone, replaced by the grim theater of a homicide investigation. Miller walked to the edge of the ditch, his face a stoic mask, and looked down. The body of a young woman, partially submerged in the cold, shallow water, was identified shortly thereafter. It was Anne Paetz. She was found lying on her back, clothed in the same jeans and sweater she had been wearing the night she disappeared. The 12 days in the water had taken their toll, but it was clear she had not died here. This was a dump site, a place of callous disposal. Miller's eyes traced the scene, noting the lack of a struggle, the absence of blood on the grassy bank. She was killed somewhere else, and her body was brought here later, likely under the cover of darkness. The news hit the Paetz family like a physical blow, a final, brutal end to the torture of uncertainty. The hope they had clung to so desperately was extinguished, replaced by a grief so profound it seemed to have its own gravity. The entire community of Saginaw mourned with them. The abstract fear of a missing person had now become the concrete reality of a murdered child. The official autopsy, performed by the county medical examiner, laid bare the violence Anne had suffered in her final moments. The official cause of death was determined to be multiple stab wounds to the chest. The report was clinical, its sterile language a horrifying counterpoint to the brutal act it described. Victim, Anne Paetz. Female, age 23. Cause of death, exsanguination due to multiple perforations of the heart and lungs. Manner of death, homicide. Summary of findings: the victim sustained approximately 18 stab wounds, primarily concentrated in the upper thoracic region. Several wounds were deep, indicating a significant degree of force. Defensive wounds were present on the victim's hands and forearms, suggesting a struggle occurred prior to death. The nature of the weapon was consistent with a single-edged knife. Blade length approximately 4 to 6 inches. The defensive wounds spoke of Anne's final, desperate fight for her life. She had not been a passive victim. She had fought her attacker. That detail, while horrific, gave a small measure of comfort to her family. She had been a fighter to the very end. But it also deepened the mystery. The struggle had not happened at the roadside. The ground around her car was undisturbed. It had not happened here, at the ditch. It had happened in a third location, a place only the killer knew. Miller stood in the morgue, the cold, sterile air doing little to numb the anger building in his chest. He looked at the file in his hands, at the black and white photo of a smiling Anne clipped to the front. He had a body, he had a cause of death, but he was no closer to finding the face of the monster who had done this. The killer had been careful. He had chosen his victim, his method, and his locations with a terrifying deliberation. He's not just a killer, Miller muttered to Rossi back at the precinct. The case file spread across his desk like a grim tapestry. He's a predator. He disabled the car, played the part of the helpful stranger, and lured her into his vehicle. He took her somewhere private, and that's where he killed her. The investigation now had a new, terrible urgency. They weren't just looking for a kidnapper anymore. They were hunting a murderer, a phantom who had driven the dark highways of Michigan, taken a life full of promise, and then vanished back into the night as if he were never there at all. Chapter 4: The Hunt for a Phantom. With the discovery of Anne's body, the case transformed from a missing persons investigation into a full-blown homicide manhunt. The pressure on Detective Miller and his team was immense, not just from their superiors, but from a terrified public and a grieving family deserving of justice. The investigation exploded in a dozen different directions at once, a frantic search for any thread that might lead to the killer. The first and most logical place to start was with the people closest to Anne. The fiancé, David Pohl, was interviewed for a third time. But this time it was different. The gentle, concerned questions were replaced with the hard-edged, probing inquiries of a homicide interrogation. Detectives needed to officially clear him, and the only way to do that was to treat him as a suspect. David, hollowed out by grief, patiently answered every question, his alibi unshakable. He had been at his apartment in Ypsilanti, and multiple neighbors confirmed hearing his television and seeing his car parked outside all night. He took a polygraph test and passed without any indication of deception. His pain was raw and achingly real. He was a victim in this tragedy, not a perpetrator. Family and friends, investigators meticulously interviewed Anne's inner circle. They were searching for any hint of trouble in her life, a secret she was keeping, an enemy she had made, a recent argument, an obsessive ex-boyfriend. They found nothing. The portrait that emerged was consistent and clear. Anne was a happy, well-adjusted young woman, deeply in love and excited about her future. There was no secret life, no dark entanglement. She was exactly who she appeared to be. This lack of internal conflict in Anne's life forced the investigation outward, into the terrifying realm of the unknown. The prevailing theory solidified around the Good Samaritan killer. This was most likely a crime of opportunity, committed by a predator who saw a young woman in a vulnerable situation and seized the moment. The police released a public plea for information. They were desperate to find anyone who had been driving on I-75 near the Clio exit between 10 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. on the night of April 10. Billboards went up, news reports ran on a loop. The response was overwhelming, but most of it was useless noise, vague recollections and well-intentioned but unhelpful tips. Then, a promising lead emerged. A truck driver called the hotline. He remembered seeing Anne's Ford Pinto on the shoulder of the highway that night. More importantly, he remembered seeing another vehicle pulled up behind it. It was a large, dark-colored sedan, possibly a Chevy or a Ford from the mid-1970s. He also saw two figures standing between the vehicles. One was a woman matching Anne's description. The other was a man. The trucker couldn't provide a detailed description. It was dark, and he was driving past at 55 miles per hour. But he gave them something crucial. The man was white, tall, with a medium build and dark, shaggy hair. He was wearing a flannel or denim jacket, working with the trucker and a sketch artist from the Michigan State Police. They created a composite sketch. It was the face of a ghost, drawn from a fleeting memory on a dark highway. The sketch showed a man in his late 20s or early 30s, with a long face, deep-set eyes, and a blank, almost placid expression. It was an everyman's face, the kind you could see in any bar or gas station in the Midwest. The sketch was blasted across every newspaper and television station in the state. "Have you seen this man?" the headlines screamed. The sketch generated a new flood of tips. Miller and Rossi spent weeks running down leads, chasing phantom suspects from Detroit to the Upper Peninsula. They interviewed dozens of men who vaguely resembled the drawing. They investigated recently released convicts, known sex offenders, and men with histories of violence who lived anywhere near the I-75 corridor. Each lead ended in a frustrating dead end. The man in the sketch remained a phantom. As the primary investigation stalled, a few unsettling, secondary theories began to surface among the detectives. The red herring, a local man from the Montrose area, known to police for petty crimes and a history of erratic behavior, became a person of interest. He drove a car similar to the one described by the trucker and had no solid alibi for the night of the murder. He was brought in for questioning. He was arrogant and evasive. Enjoying the attention, Miller leaned on him hard. But his story, while full of holes, never broke. There was no physical evidence to link him to the crime. And after weeks of surveillance, he was eventually dismissed as a likely dead end, a man who got a thrill from being close to the flame, but wasn't the one who started the fire. The targeted attack. Could the Good Samaritan scenario be a cover? What if Anne was targeted specifically? The loosened lug nuts suggested premeditation. Someone could have followed her from Ypsilanti, waiting for the right moment. Or someone in her orbit, someone investigators had missed, could have known her route and schedule. They re-interviewed everyone, looking at the case from this new, more sinister angle. But again, they found nothing. No one in Anne's life had a motive to commit such a brutal act. The theory, while tantalizing, felt like forcing a narrative onto a set of facts that pointed stubbornly toward a random act of violence. The weeks turned into months. The case file on Detective Miller's desk grew thicker, a dense brick of reports, interviews, and dead-end leads. The composite sketch was still pinned to the corkboard in the squad room, its blank eyes a daily reminder of their failure. The phantom had a face, but he still had no name. The initial frenzy of the investigation slowed to a frustrating crawl. The hunter was losing the trail. Miller would often drive the stretch of I-75 where Anne's car was found, pulling over onto the gravel shoulder. He'd get out, the roar of passing traffic a constant drone, and try to put himself in her shoes. He'd imagine the fear, the confusion, the relief at seeing headlights pull up behind her, the disarming smile of the man who stepped out to help. He tried to see the face of evil, but all he saw was the reflection of his own frustrated, weary face in the window of his patrol car. The killer was out there, somewhere, living a normal life, holding a job, perhaps with a family of his own. A man with a monstrous secret, hidden behind the facade of an ordinary face. Chapter 5. A shadow over the state. A single, brutal murder can terrorize a neighborhood. But a murder like Anne Paetz's, random, predatory, and unsolved, does something more. It poisons the well of a community's sense of security. The crime didn't just create a void in one family, it cast a long, cold shadow over the entire region, from the university town of Ann Arbor to the working-class heart of Saginaw. In the small town of Montrose and the nearby city of Clio, the effect was immediate and visceral. This wasn't some distant headline from Detroit. This was on their doorstep. The spot where Anne's car was found was a place they all drove past. A familiar landmark that was now irrevocably tainted. People started locking their doors, something many in the rural communities had rarely bothered with before. Parents gave their teenage daughters new, stricter curfews. The casual trust between strangers began to erode. replaced by a reflexive suspicion. Every man who vaguely resembled the composite sketch earned a second, fearful glance at the grocery store or the gas station. The local diners and coffee shops, typically hubs of light-hearted gossip, were now filled with hushed, anxious conversations. "Did you hear? They still haven't found him," a waitress might say, refilling a coffee cup. "My husband says I shouldn't even drive to Flint by myself anymore," a customer would reply, staring out the window. Not after dark. The story became a cautionary tale, a piece of local folklore born from a real-life horror. Young women were warned, "Don't pull over for anyone. If you get a flat tire, lock your doors and wait for the police. If a stranger offers help, be wary." The simple, kind gesture of a Good Samaritan was now fraught with terrifying potential. The killer hadn't just taken Anne's life, he had stolen a piece of the community's innocence. The fear radiated outward. At the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where Anne had been a student, a palpable sense of unease settled over the campus. Anne was one of their own. Her murder served as a brutal reminder of the world's dangers beyond the relative safety of the university's diag. Female students stopped walking alone at night. The campus police increased patrols, and self-defense classes saw a surge in enrollment. The art department, where Anne had been a bright, promising talent, was shrouded in grief. Her empty stool in the studio was a constant, silent memorial. For investigators, this heightened public fear was both a blessing and a curse. The flood of tips continued, a testament to a community desperate to help. But it was also a deluge of paranoia. Dozens of innocent men were reported to the police simply because they wore a flannel shirt or had shaggy hair. Each tip had to be investigated, draining precious time and resources, pulling detectives further away from the few credible leads they had. The media coverage fed the growing anxiety. Newspapers like the Saginaw News and the Detroit Free Press ran extensive features on the case. They delved into Anne's life, printing photos of her smiling with her family, making the loss feel personal to thousands of readers. They also explored the darker side, speculating about the killer's psychology. Was he a local, a transient passing through? Was this his first kill? Or was he a seasoned predator? One particularly chilling article quoted a criminal psychologist, who theorized, "This offender is likely a chameleon. He appears normal, even charming. He is adept at wearing a mask of social conformity. The act of disabling the vehicle and then offering assistance shows a high degree of predatory planning and patience. He enjoys the power dynamic, the control he exerts over his victim from the very beginning. This is not an impulsive act. This is the work of a hunter." This profile, while speculative, terrified the public. The monster wasn't a drooling ghoul hiding in the woods. He could be their neighbor, their co-worker, the friendly man who held the door for them at the post office. The shadow of the I-75 killer, as he was sometimes called, loomed over everything. It was a fear that would linger for years, becoming a dark footnote in the state's history. Long after the headlines faded, the story of Anne Paetz would be whispered from one generation to the next. A grim reminder of a promise unfulfilled and a killer who was never caught. Chapter 6: The I-75 Corridor and Other Whispers. As the active investigation into Anne's murder began to lose momentum, Detective Miller found himself spending late nights in the archives, his desk lamp casting a lonely circle of light on maps and old case files. The official leads were drying up, but a nagging thought kept him awake. Was Anne Paetz an isolated incident, a single bolt of lightning from a clear sky, or was she part of a larger, more terrifying storm? He started with a map of Michigan and a box of red pins. He placed the first pin where Anne's car was found on I-75. He placed a second where her body was recovered. Then, he started looking for others. He pulled the files on every unsolved murder of a young woman in the state from the last 5 years. He focused on cases with specific hallmarks, victims abducted from public or semi-public places, evidence of a sexual assault component, even if not the primary motive, and bodies dumped in rural, secluded areas. Slowly, methodically, more red pins began to dot the map, many of them clustering along the major arteries of the state: I-75, I-96, US 23. A pattern began to emerge, faint but undeniable. The highways that were the lifeblood of the state's economy and culture were also, it seemed, a hunting ground. Miller's attention was drawn to a few cases in particular. The case of Jane Doe No. 1, 1978, 2 years before Anne's murder. The body of a young woman was found in a wooded area just off I-96. West of Lansing. She had been stabbed, and her identity was never discovered. Her car was never located, but the similarities in the disposal of the body, left in a secluded spot, miles from any urban center, were striking. The disappearance of Kelly Politzer, 1979, a 20-year-old student from the Lansing area, vanished after her car broke down on the side of a country road. Her car, like Anne's, was found with its keys in the ignition and her purse inside. She was never seen again. No body was ever recovered. But the parallels to the beginning of Anne's case were impossible to ignore. A disabled vehicle, a vulnerable young woman, a complete disappearance. The murder of Susan Jacques, 1980, just a few months after Anne was killed. Another young woman, Susan Jacques, was abducted from a shopping mall parking lot in suburban Detroit, not far from the I-75 corridor. Her body was found weeks later in a field. Miles away, she, too, had been stabbed. Miller laid the files side by side. The connections were circumstantial, tenuous at best. The MOs weren't identical, but they rhymed. The victims were all young, attractive women. They were all taken from situations where they were temporarily vulnerable. The killer or killers showed a chilling geographical comfort, using the state's highway system to find victims and dispose of evidence across different jurisdictions, complicating the investigations. He brought his findings to his captain. "Look at this," Miller said, pointing to the pin-pricked map. "It's a corridor." He moves up and down the highway. He could be a trucker, a traveling salesman, someone whose job gives him a reason to be on the road at all hours, someone who wouldn't be noticed. The captain, a by-the-book man wary of sensational theories, was skeptical. "Frank, you're connecting dots that might not be there. The stabbing in the Detroit case was different. The Politzer girl was never found. These are tragedies, yes, but that doesn't make them the work of one man. It feels wrong to ignore it." Miller pressed. "We're all in our own little bubbles here. Saginaw County works its cases. Ingham County works theirs. Nobody's looking at the big picture. What if we're all hunting for different pieces of the same guy?" The idea of a serial killer operating along Michigan's highways was a deeply disturbing one. Something that felt more at home in the pages of a thriller novel than in the quiet realities of the Midwest. Law enforcement in that era was far more localized, and interdepartmental communication on cold cases was not what it is today. The concept of VCAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, was still in its infancy at the FBI. Miller's theory was largely dismissed as conjecture, a frustrated detective's attempt to find patterns in chaos. No official task force was ever formed. The cases remained separate, isolated tragedies in the files of their respective departments. Yet, the whispers persisted, among cops in smoky bars and detectives at regional meetings. The idea of the I-75 killer, or the highway phantom, would surface from time to time. They would trade stories about their own local Jane Does, their own unsolved abductions. They all had a case like Anne Paetz in their files, a case that went cold. That left them with a feeling of profound unease. A sense that the piece of the puzzle they held belonged to a much larger, darker picture they couldn't quite see. The potential connection to other murders added another layer of chilling complexity to Anne's case. It suggested that her death might not have been a random, one-off act of violence, but a single chapter in a much longer, bloodier story. The phantom they were hunting might have had more than one face, more than one name, and Anne might have been only one of his many victims, her memory lost among the other whispers on the wind. Chapter 7, The Long Silence. The months following Anne Paetz's murder bled into a year, then 2, then 5. The initial torrent of leads dwindled to a trickle, and then to nothing at all. The case, once a fixture on the front page and the 6 o'clock news, faded from the public consciousness, replaced by new tragedies and fresher headlines. But for the Paetz family and for Detective Frank Miller, there was no moving on. There was only the long, deafening silence of an unanswered question. The case file was officially moved from active to open unsolved, a bureaucratic term for what was, in essence, a cold case. The thick folder, filled with hundreds of pages of reports, photographs, and dead-end interviews, was placed in a filing cabinet in the records room, a paper tombstone for a stolen life. For Anne's parents, Eleanor and Joseph, life became a quiet agony of waiting. Every time the phone rang, a jolt of adrenaline, a fleeting, irrational hope that it would be the police with news. Every time a face in a crowd vaguely resembled the composite sketch. A flicker of dread. Holidays were the hardest. Anne's empty chair at the Thanksgiving table. The unopened presents under the Christmas tree the first year. Each tradition was a fresh reminder of their loss. They kept her room exactly as she had left it. A sanctuary of memory filled with her paintings, her books, and the lingering scent of her perfume. It was their way of refusing to let her fade away, of keeping a part of her alive in a world that had forgotten her. They gave few interviews over the years, their grief too private, too profound for public display. But in one rare conversation with a local reporter on the 10th anniversary of the murder, Joseph Paetz said, his voice heavy with the weight of a decade of sorrow, "You don't get over it. You just carry it. We just want to know who did this. We want to know why. Before we go, we just want to have an answer." For Detective Miller, the case became a personal ghost. It was the one that burrowed under his skin and stayed there. Other cases came and went, many of them solved, but the Paetz file was a constant, nagging reminder of failure. He'd pull it out every few months, on a quiet night shift or a slow weekend, and go over it again, page by page. He'd stare at the crime scene photos, at the haunting image of the green Pinto on the side of the road, at the blank-eyed face of the composite sketch. He was searching for something he might have missed, some tiny detail, some overlooked connection. He'd traced the chain of events in his mind, a tortuous loop he couldn't break. The flat tire, the loosened lug nuts, the Good Samaritan, the abduction, the murder, the ditch. Each step felt so clear, so deliberate on the killer's part. It was the who that remained a complete and utter blank. The Phantom had committed a perfect crime, leaving behind no fingerprints, no witnesses who could identify him, no physical evidence that could be traced. In a pre-DNA world, the case was a brick wall. Miller retired in the late 1990s, after 30 years on the force. On his last day, as he was cleaning out his desk, he paused at the filing cabinet. He opened the drawer and pulled out the Paetz file, its cover soft and worn from years of handling. He took one last look at Anne's smiling face, a young woman frozen in time at 23. He felt a profound sense of letting her down. He passed the case on to a new generation of detectives, along with his notes and his theories about the I-75 corridor, hoping that fresh eyes might see what he could not. The silence continued. The years piled up, forming a barrier of time between the vibrant, living memory of Anne and the cold, static facts of her murder. The world changed. Technology advanced in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1980. The composite sketch yellowed with age. The witnesses grew older, their memories fading. The trail, once merely cold, was now frozen solid, buried under 2 decades of snow. For all intents and purposes, the killer had gotten away with it. He had slipped back into the quiet anonymity of everyday life. And the secret of what happened on that dark stretch of I-75 was his alone to keep. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Digital Age. The 21st century arrived, bringing with it a technological revolution that would change the face of crime solving forever. DNA profiling, once a theoretical concept, became a standard tool in forensics. The rise of the internet created a global community of amateur sleuths. And a new genre of entertainment, true crime, exploded in popularity through podcasts and documentary series. Cold cases, once left to gather dust in police archives, were suddenly being re-examined, resurrected by new technology and renewed public interest. It was in this new landscape that the ghost of Anne Paetz began to stir. In the early 2010s, a young, ambitious detective in the Saginaw County Sheriff's Department, Detective Sarah Jenkins, was assigned to the department's newly formed cold case unit. One of the first files that landed on her desk was the thick, worn folder marked PAETZ. Anne M. She read through it, her modern perspective clashing with the 1980s police work. She saw the familiar patterns of a homicide investigation, but she also saw missed opportunities, evidence collected but never tested with modern methods, potential links to other cases never formally pursued. Her first order of business was to track down the physical evidence. It was a long shot, evidence from cases that old was often lost, degraded, or destroyed, but after a painstaking search in the department's deep storage, she found it, a sealed box containing items recovered from the crime scene and the autopsy. Most importantly, it contained scrapings taken from underneath Anne's fingernails. The report from 1980 noted the presence of foreign tissue, likely skin from her attacker, gathered during her final, desperate struggle. Back then, all they could do was determine that it wasn't her own. Now, there was a possibility, however slim, that a DNA profile could be extracted. If we can get a profile, Jenkins explained to her captain, her voice filled with a cautious optimism. We can run it through CODIS. The killer might have been arrested for something else over the last 30 years. He could be in the system. The evidence was sent to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab. The wait was agonizing. Weeks turned into months. Meanwhile, Jenkins began the arduous task of re-interviewing everyone she could find who was connected to the case. She found a retired Frank Miller living quietly in northern Michigan. He was in his late 70s now, his memory a little hazy on some details. But the Paetz case was etched into his mind. He spent an entire afternoon with Jenkins, walking her through the original investigation, his old frustrations and theories bubbling to the surface. I always believed he was a traveler, Miller told her, his voice raspy with age. Someone who knew the highways. Keep looking at those other cases along I-75. I swear to God, the answer is in there somewhere. At the same time, Anne's story found a new life online. A popular true crime podcast, Midwest Macabre, dedicated an entire episode to her case. The host, a journalist with a knack for immersive storytelling, brought the 40-year-old mystery to a global audience. He interviewed a retired Miller, quoted from old newspaper articles, and spoke with one of Anne's childhood friends. The podcast was a sensation. Suddenly, tens of thousands of people were hearing Anne's name for the first time. Online forums on sites like Reddit lit up with discussions. Armchair detectives pored over the known facts, dissecting the timeline, analyzing the composite sketch, and proposing their own theories. Was it the Genesee County coin-op killer, a suspect in a string of laundromat assaults from the era? Could it have been the notorious serial killer Donald Leroy Evans, who was active in the 80s and 90s? Though his known crimes were far to the south, the old whispers of a highway serial killer were revived, now amplified through the echo chamber of the internet. The renewed attention brought a fresh wave of tips to the sheriff's department. Most of them speculative, but a few intriguing enough for Jenkins to follow up. A man called, claiming his now deceased uncle had always given him the creeps, drove a dark sedan in 1980, and had made a strange comment once about a girl with a flat tire. The lead, like so many before it, eventually went nowhere, but it showed that the case was once again alive in the public's imagination. Then, the call came from the crime lab. They had been successful. They had extracted a partial male DNA profile from the evidence found under Anne's fingernails. It was a monumental breakthrough, the first truly new lead in over 30 years. Detective Jenkins felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the key. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database. Jenkins and her team waited, hoping for a hit, a match to a convicted offender or an arrestee. Days passed, then a week. The result came back. No match found. The phantom was not in the system. It was a devastating blow. The best piece of evidence they had, a tangible link to the killer himself, led to another brick wall. He was a ghost in the machine. 2. He had either died without ever being entered into the system, or he had managed to live his entire life without being arrested for a crime serious enough to require a DNA sample. The echo of the past had grown louder for a moment, promising an answer, a final note to a story that had been silent for too long. But just as quickly, it faded back into the same frustrating silence that had haunted the case from the very beginning. Chapter 9, The Haunting. The DNA was a dead end. The new leads from the podcast dried up. The flurry of renewed activity on the case settled back into the quiet, steady rhythm of an unsolved homicide. The file remains open, but it sits once again on a shelf, waiting for a new technology, a deathbed confession, or a miracle. And so, the story of Anne Paetz ends where it began, on the side of a dark highway, with a question that hangs in the air like the cold Michigan mist. Who was the man who stopped to help? Who was the face in the composite sketch? The phantom who drove the interstate, hunting for a moment of vulnerability. Was he a local man who lived a double life? A monster hidden behind a mask of normalcy? Was he a transient, a specter who blew through town and disappeared forever? Or was he something more prolific and terrifying? A serial killer who left a string of broken lives along the concrete veins of the state. His crimes disconnected, his bloody ledger never fully tallied. We will likely never know. The man who killed Anne Paetz is very likely an old man now. If he is alive at all, he may have died of natural causes, taking his secret to the grave. He may be sitting in a nursing home somewhere, the memories of his horrific acts faded by dementia. Or he may still be out there, a grandfather who watches his grandchildren play. His hands, once stained with the blood of an innocent young artist, now used to push a swing set. It is this last possibility that is the most chilling of all. The true tragedy of this case is not just the violent end of a promising life, but the theft of a future. Anne never got to marry David. She never had her first gallery show. Her parents, Eleanor and Joseph, both passed away without ever getting the answer they so desperately sought. They are buried near their daughter, their shared headstone a testament to a family irrevocably broken by a single, senseless act of violence. Tonight, if you find yourself driving on a lonely stretch of I-75 in the dark, heading north past the Clio exit, you might feel a sudden chill. You might glance over at the gravel shoulder and see, for a fleeting moment in your headlights, the ghost of a green Ford Pinto. It's not a real ghost, of course. It's an echo. It's the memory of a young woman who was just trying to get home. Remember her name, Anne Paetz. She was an artist, a daughter, a fiancée. Her life was a canvas just beginning to be filled with color. But a man with darkness in his heart saw that canvas and chose, for reasons we will never understand, to paint it black. Her killer stole her future, but he cannot steal her story. And in telling it, we keep a small part of her alive, and we refuse to let the phantom who took her from this world have the final, silent word. Thank you for listening to American Gothic. Be safe out there.